Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. Where is my... It's got a fancy little case to it. Let's see. I'm just going to check to see that it works. No. Is this the right one? Give me 1 second. All right. Got a different one. Let's try this again. Good morning. How's everyone doing? Good? All right. Thanks, everyone, for being here in the morning. My name's Casey, and I'm here to talk to you about user onboarding and why I feel like it's the most important part of your growth strategy. Before we get into that, a little bit about me. I work on helping companies scale, org structures, product teams, growth, you name it. And as an employee, I led the growth team at Pinterest from about 40 million monthly active users to 150 million. I started the marketing team at GrubHub, which is an online food delivery company in the US. It went public. I was a growth advisor in residence at Greylock Partners, which is a Series A and B venture capital firm. And I started my career as an analyst at apartments.com. And now I work full-time as an advisor to a lot of consumer marketplaces, network-driven businesses on how to scale their businesses. So like Eventbrite, Reddit, Thumbtack, a bunch of others. Okay, so first I'm going to begin by talking about why would you focus on user onboarding? You have lots of different features you want to build. You have lots of different things you can spend your time on. Why onboarding? And the argument that I will make is that if you look at any of your cohorts for your products, what you'll inevitably see is a large drop-off at the beginning, and hopefully some people stick around and long-term build a habit. So onboarding attacks the people at the very beginning of that cohort that tend to drop out. So it tends to be the biggest driver of retention if you can improve how many people successfully onboard into your product. But what's even more interesting about working on things that improve retention is that in all the best companies, retention takes care of your acquisition for you. If you retain a lot of users, they can tell other people about it. If you retain a lot of users, they can create content which can be distributed to lots of other potential users. Or if you retain a lot of users, you make a lot of money from them, which you can reinvest in acquiring users via paid channels or sales channels. So not only is onboarding the biggest driver of your retention, indirectly, it ends up being the biggest driver of acquisition as well. So what happens when you underinvest in onboarding, like a lot of companies do? The first is that you just create a bad user experience when people are coming in. They're trying to figure out what your product is about. They can't tell. They can't see the value. They end up churning. And that means all these people you're working very hard to bring into your product are dropping out, and then you have to replace them to grow, which usually means slow growth, bad retention. But the other thing I've noticed is when you don't spend a lot of time thinking about how you onboard the product, you're paying attention to someone else. You're paying attention to, instead of the new users of your product, you're paying attention to the people who got through your onboarding experience to become retained users. These people become power users, they understand the product really well, and they start asking for more advanced features. They're trying to get more value out of this product that they already love. So if you're not paying attention to new users and focusing on onboarding, you build those features. You build features for the people who are already retained. And then when new users come in, they start seeing these advanced features. The product's more complicated. It's harder to understand. It's harder to connect to the value. And your retention rate goes down over time for new users. So how do you think about optimizing for onboarding? What's the measure of success? And the way that I like to break it down is there is a key action, which is what is something the user can do in your product that indicates that they likely received value from it? And then the designated frequency, which is how often you would expect someone to want to receive that value. And that's a little bit hand-wavy, so I'm going to get to some examples here. So let's start with Pinterest. For Pinterest, when I joined, we actually weren't sure what the key action should be. You could scroll through a lot of images. You could click on an image to go to where the content came from to find out more information about it. Or you could save that image for later. And what we found qualitatively is you could be scrolling through a lot of images because you had a lot of intent to find something, but you weren't actually finding it. So it didn't necessarily say that we were being successful for you if you scrolled through a lot of images. And if you clicked through an image to go to the place where it came from, we found that a lot of times that image was clickbait. It didn't actually give you the experience you wanted. It overpromised and it under-delivered. But if you saved an image that you saw on Pinterest, if you saved a pin for later, that tells us that we showed you something that you liked enough to want to get back to it, so that became our key action. And when we did the quantitative analysis for this, saving was by far better correlated to a retained user over time than any of those other key actions. So for designated frequency, this can be harder in some products. And for Pinterest, we didn't know the answer to this as well. So the way that I like to figure out the answer to this question is, what is the offline analog to your product? Before your product existed, how did people try to solve this problem? And how often did they solve it? And the offline analog for Pinterest, where did people go to browse inspiration related to topics of interest? They bought magazines, which came on a monthly or weekly subscription. So our initial designated frequency was monthly, and then we later changed it to weekly. For GrubHub, a place where you order food online, it's much simpler understanding what the key action of the product should be. All you can do is order food, have it come to you, and it be delicious. So the key action is how many people we get to actually order food online. And of course, people ordered food before GrubHub existed. So we just called them up and asked them, hey, how often do you order food by calling the restaurant? And most people said once or twice a month if they were people who order delivery. So our designated frequency for GrubHub was monthly. OK, so you have your key action and you have your designated frequency. Then you could build an appropriate cohort chart. So this is a chart of new people who signed up during a period of time. And on the y-axis, you have the percentage of those users who perform the key action. And on the x-axis, you have your designated frequency. And what you want to do is track how many people continue to do the key action at the designated frequency to the point at which you can predict they're going to continue to do it. There's no people dropping out of this funnel, out of this cohort. And with products that don't have product market fit, this will go to 0. Eventually, none of the people you brought in will continue using the product. But for products that have product market fit, you typically see something like this. There's still a bunch of people who churn. That's normal. But then there's this light blue, people who actually get the value and they build a habit. So what you're trying to figure out is, what is this point here at which you stop losing people? And that's what we call your habit metric. That's the habit moment when people are like, yes, I'm going to continue to use this thing regularly. And of course, what you can tell from that cohort is people don't immediately just try a new product and then build that habit. That habit is built over time. So what I like to do is work backwards to what are the things that get people to that habit. And there's 2 particular steps I want to talk about. The first is the aha moment, which is the first time someone experiences the value of the product and they understand it. And the setup moment is the work that both the user and the company has to do to reliably get the user to the aha moment. And I'll show a bunch of examples of this. But before I do that, OK, you have this onboarding problem. Who actually works on this problem? And this is not a sales problem. This is not a marketing problem. These are usually cross-functional teams of product managers, designers, engineers, user researchers, analysts, figuring out what's preventing people from reaching the habit and making changes to the product and testing them to see if they're making an improvement on where that cohort curve actually flattens, how many people actually get to that habit moment. So if you have an understanding of a team that's going to be working on this, being this cross-functional team, where does their work end and where does the core product begin? Well, I would argue that an onboarding team's work is everything in the product until people get to the habit moment. Everything up until the point where you can reliably predict the user that came back this week or last month is going to come back at the designated frequency again. So at Pinterest, it took 4 weeks to get people to the habit moment. So our onboarding team owned the entire product experience for the first 4 weeks of the product. And I won't lie, That initially was pretty scary to our core product team. They didn't like that so much. But as soon as we were able to communicate, hey, the mission of onboarding is to make sure people use all the amazing things that you build, then it's like, oh, I kind of like that as a core product PM. I have this other team that's making sure people understand the value of what I'm building and are going to use it regularly. And then I can focus on making that thing more valuable over time. Okay, so how do you actually improve your onboarding? Well, it's a combination of both talking to users and metrics. You have to look at what people are doing in your product and what they're not doing, and understand where are the opportunities for improvement. Where can you get people to focus that they're more likely to onboard? What are the things where they're getting trapped, where maybe you want to prevent them from getting there? But you also have to talk to users. Metrics is a good way to understand what people are doing or not doing in your product, but talking to users is the only reason you can is the only way to understand why they're doing or not doing things. So you have to pair these two things together to really understand where the big opportunities are. All right, so let's take some examples from my experience. So let's start with GrubHub. GrubHub, the point of the product is to get you to find restaurants to order from and then place those orders online. And what we were finding is, this is a graph that I did quite a few years ago now of Boston, which was the third city we launched in the US. And on the y-axis is the conversion rate to an online order. And on the x-axis is how many restaurants actually would deliver to you when you typed in your address. And what we saw invariably in every market is at some point there's a step change where we are showing a lot more restaurants than you thought could actually deliver to you, and your chances of converting almost double, and your likelihood of onboarding successfully, of retaining, how many orders you place on a monthly basis also increased. So this is an example of using the data to find a problem, and then of course, we have to identify a solution. And in our case, we focused on what are all the areas where we're not reliably getting people to this number of restaurants, so we can focus our sales efforts to get more restaurants available in those areas. So this is an example of using the quantitative data to find insights. But we also talk to users. And when we talk to users, we'd say, oh, why don't you use GrubHub, or why don't you use GrubHub more often? And they would say, oh, it's expensive. We're like, oh, that's interesting. We don't actually charge you to order food. We charge the restaurant for the additional orders that we provide them. But what they meant is that in a lot of cities, there was a delivery minimum and a delivery fee. So in order for you to hit that minimum, say you're a single person, you might have to order 2 entrees instead of 1. And you'd be spending more than you wanted to spend to get dinner. So once we had this information, we went back to our restaurants and we said, hey, we think there's a lot of latent demand to order food more often that you're missing because your minimums and fees are too high. We think if you drop these fees, that you will see a lot more volume that will make up for the smaller margin on a per order basis. And a key thing that people don't understand about food delivery is restaurants are usually constrained not by their kitchen capacity, they are constrained by their seating capacity. They can almost always pump out more food from the kitchen. What they can't do is fit more people inside. So with this large fixed asset that they can pump more food out of, they're usually willing to take a lower margin because it's essentially an entirely margin business, food delivery. So we convinced a random Costa Rican restaurant in Chicago to try this. Fairly middle of the road restaurant, and we got them to drop their minimum. They immediately shot to the #1 restaurant in Chicago, which was our largest market at the time. So then what we did is we built a case study around what they did and the impact they saw, and we distributed it to all the other restaurants in their area to help us systematically lower these minimums and fees, increasing our activation rates, increasing our retention, and increasing the engagement from retained users. Okay, what is the setup moment for GrubHub? Well, delivery restaurants, they deliver based on streets, not based on neighborhoods, not based on zip codes. So in order for GrubHub to reliably show you which restaurants actually deliver to you, we need to know your physical address. And especially when we're starting out, that's a pretty daunting thing to ask a new user for. But we knew based on the data that if we did not get this, the chances of you finding a restaurant that could actually deliver to you and placing an order were very low. So we made this very difficult thing, asking a user to give us your physical address, the beginning of the product. And this is part of the setup moment. But again, back to that graph I showed earlier, this alone is not the setup moment. That's the work we ask the user to do. What's the work that GrubHub has to do? We have to make sure you see a ton of amazing restaurants to order from when you give us that address. And if we can reliably get a user to type in their address and show them 50+ restaurants to order from, their chances of reaching the aha moment and then reaching the habit moment are much higher. Okay. How is this different for Pinterest? So this is the Pinterest product. I think they took the screenshot in maybe 2014. And what you may notice is that there's a lot going on here. We're asking the user to invite friends to Pinterest. We're asking the user to find friends that are already on Pinterest. There's a bunch of images here. Some are picked for you because we think you'll like them. Some are based on a topic you follow. Some are because your friend pinned it to a board and you follow your friend. New users, when they signed up for this, were so confused. They're like, what should I be doing here? I don't know what's going on. And as we looked into the data and we looked at the people who navigated this area successfully, we saw that the people who figured out how to get to content they liked and saved it were the people who hit the habit moment most reliably. Some other interesting things we saw from the qualitative research is I spent much of 2014 and 2015 traveling to different countries to watch people use the product because Pinterest wasn't growing internationally. And invariably what we saw is that they would sign up, they'd have a perfectly localized landing page, they'd go through onboarding, and then they'd get to a page with all English content. And they would tell us things like, hey, I can read English, I don't want to. Or, hey, this recipe has almonds in it. We don't have almonds in our country. I don't know what to do with this. Or, what's a tablespoon? Basically, everything about our product was recommending American content with American descriptions. So we had to completely change our product to showcase content that was important locally, that matched your interest in your language. And then we started having higher activation rates. And we came across an axiom for us, which is we want to get the user to the aha moment as fast as possible, but not faster. And what that means is we have to figure out what's the friction we need to insert to make sure we get people to relevant local content, because if we just drop you into popular content, your chances of finding things you like are very low. So we ended up simplifying the quote-unquote mandatory steps because they don't actually help you get to the product value. So here, this is the Android sign-up flow. We started pre-populating your email address on Android. When we pre-populate your email address, we do that by reading the contact list of your phone, which means then we can check the name on that phone to pre-populate your name. In this case, Eva, one of the engineers who worked on this project. So essentially, the sign-up process became pre-populated email and name. You can type your age or your gender, or you can skip it. And instead of adding a password, we're going to set a token on the device so that you can always get in on that device. So we made getting into the product flow extremely easy, basically no typing on mobile. But then we put the friction. We have to ask you which topics you're interested in before we'll actually show you the product. Because Pinterest is a product to connect you to your interest. If we don't know what your interests are, then you're inevitably going to get the interests of, middle America, because that's where we're most popular. We also started removing a lot of the clutter that I showed in that previous screen. So on the left, you can see there's imagery, there's where it came from, there's who pinned it to what board, and on the right, we deleted all of that. And what happened is, what we're trying to get you to in this moment is content that you care about. So the more images we can show on screen at one point in time, the more likely you're going to find something that's interesting to you, the more likely you're going to save it for later, the more likely you're going to retain to the Pinterest product. What we also did is when you downloaded the app and used it for the first time, we started telling you what you should be doing. there's a very popular kind of quote that goes around the design community that says, if a design needs education, it's a bad design. My response to that is a design that educates is better than a design that does not. If you need to throw in some education to get the user into the right spot, feel free to do so. In this particular case, when a person lands on the home feed for the first time, we just ask them to scroll to see more. And when they stop scrolling, that user education says, tap any pin for a closer look. And when you tap on a pin, then we have a pulsar over the save button indicating that that's the key action that you should do on this page. And just adding these simple steps increased our activation rates, increased the number of people that we got to the habit moment. So these things don't need to be fancy to work. One of the things that you should think about for your business is, how quick do I need to get people into the user value? How quick do I need to show them that aha moment? And it depends on both the intent of the user coming in and the timeliness of the need. So let's take something on the far end of the spectrum, doing your taxes. Doing your taxes is something you need to do, or else you will go to jail. So it doesn't matter how much friction is involved in the process, people will figure it out. They will spend the time to get it done. Pinterest is much more on the opposite end of this spectrum. Most people who are signing up for Pinterest, they're not exactly sure what to expect. They heard about it from a friend or a search engine. They're not sure exactly what they're in for, which means we needed to get the user to the aha moment extremely quickly, or they would drop off. There wasn't a lot of intent there. And for GrubHub, while users had intent, they wanted to order food, they were hungry. Because they're hungry, they're not going to waste a lot of time. If we can't get them to a restaurant to order fairly quickly, they're going to go cook something, they're going to walk outside, they're going to eat chips that they have in their pantry. So we're much more closer to the left end of the spectrum than to doing your taxes. But for B2B products, a lot of times there's extremely high intent. So you can make the person do 30 minutes, an hour, a week's worth of work potentially before they start seeing the value, because you've pre-sold them a lot more on what that value is going to be. Okay, so how do you think about using qualitative and quantitative data to help with user onboarding? So the first thing to do on the quantitative side is really analyze what activated users do versus what churn users do. And the first time you do this analysis, your data scientists will come back and they will say, anything. If a user does anything, they're way more likely to retain than users who don't do anything. And you're like, great, I kind of understood that already. The point of that is there's going to be survivorship bias in the metrics. Are the people who do things that help them retain, was it the thing they did that helped them retain, or did they have higher intent and therefore they found those activities? One of our early correlations said that if someone saves 100 pins in their first session, they're way more likely to retain. And it's like, yeah, but saving 100 pins in one session is like, takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort. That probably says more about those individual users than it does about 100 being the relevant number. So the only way to figure out whether something's a causal relationship versus correlation, besides if it's obvious, like 100 pins in a day, is to actually run an experiment and see if you can prove the causality. The first time that we ran an experiment, because we had data that said that save correlates to retention, we forced people to save. And then people didn't retain any better. So then we retooled it and we ran an experiment that focused on educating people the value of saving something. And then our activation rates did improve. Our user onboarding did become more successful. But again, I have to stress, you also have to do the qualitative side of research here. So you also want to talk with users, churned and retained. And typically the churn users are a lot harder to get to, so you have to bribe them. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to get someone who churns on the product on the phone. And inevitably, you will be asking those users, hey, do you understand the value of my product? And you'll notice differences in what churned users say versus what retained users say. It might be the case that churned users didn't get the value at all versus retained users did. Or it might be that churned users actually did get the value, but they're not the right person to experience that value. In which case, you want to target your marketing efforts better to actually reach the people who are going to find it valuable. But if you want to ask your retained users or your churn users about the onboarding experience itself, chances are you're not going to be very successful. That may have happened a month ago. They're not going to remember the details that well. So in order to actually watch people actually learn about the onboarding experience itself, you have to watch new users go through that experience. So at Pinterest, we would just put a laptop in front of a user who had never signed up before. We'd ask them to download the app on their phone, and we'd just watch. And we'd ask questions. We'd see what they do naturally. We'd ask them if they understand what the value is. We'd ask them why they went this direction versus that direction. And this was a painful exercise. You're essentially watching people fail to use a product that you've spent thousands of hours designing. But it helps you understand all the failure points so that you can go back into your product and fix them. And essentially, every time someone failed, we made a note of what happened, we went back and we tried to change it in the product, and then less people experience that in the future. So a question I get a lot is, how does user research fit into this process? And the answer is every step of the way. We had user researchers on our onboarding team that were not only at the beginning of the project, kind of figuring out, what are the issues that are preventing people from experiencing the value, but also once we started coming up with concepts, they would test wireframes, they would test prototypes to see if we're on the right track. And then once we built, an MVP, they would test that again with users. And once something's out in the wild, we would use them to understand the why behind the data. So literally user research involved in every step of the process. And look, if you're an early stage company, you typically don't have a full-time researcher, so your designer or your product manager is going to play the role of user research, and that's fine. But the earlier you can bring a full-time user researcher into the team, the better. You will not regret it. You will get so much more value out of everything that you do. Okay, so what now? You have an onboarding problem. You understand, what your target is, what metric you're trying to improve. You've done some analysis to figure out what things correlate with retention. You've talked to users. You found some of the common issues. What do you do? Do you completely re-overhaul the entire product experience for onboarding? Do you subtly, isolate some variables to test? And the answer to that depends on where you are in your process. What stage of the company are you at? And how confident are you, based on all this research, based on all this data, of how your current onboarding flow works? So if you're an early stage company, you don't have usually a lot of traffic to do A/B test and isolate the impact of the changes. So you typically just make the change you want to make, and then you see if you're getting an impact in your pre-post metrics for retention. If you're a larger company like Pinterest, you definitely do not want to do that. There are a lot of people who are already onboarding successfully, and let's say your changes are not successful for some reason, then all of a sudden your core business metrics all are impacted. So in that case, you're definitely doing an A/B test, and you're measuring how many people are getting to the habit moment in a control versus enabled group. And as I said before, at Pinterest, it takes 4 weeks to understand if people are onboarding successfully. So that means you can't make any determination on your experiment until you've seen 4 weeks of cohort data from both the enabled and control groups. And this is perhaps a slower cadence than some of your other A/B experimentation around conversion optimization or something like that, where you can tell immediately. So sometimes you're looking for correlative signals earlier in the process. Are they doing more things in day one that are likely going to correlate to them having better retention month 2? Because while Pinterest, it takes a month to reach the habit moment, for many other products, it can take much longer. It can take 6 months. And you don't want to have to do one experiment every 6 months to see if you're being impactful. You're going to try to find kind of earlier stage metrics in the process that correlate, knowing that they're not going to be perfect. The other thing that you should think about is, am I going to just isolate these variables one by one, and we're going to do this complete overhaul? And that really depends on where you are in your current onboarding strategy. If you have a lot of confidence in it, but you're identifying optimizations, then certainly isolate variables, run A/B test. But if you either don't have a lot of confidence in where it is, or you feel like it's been optimized as much as it can be, and you need to find, you're at a local maxima, you need to find something totally new, then I would emphasize just design the experience you want to design and launch that as an experiment versus the control, which is the completely old design. And if you're successful, if you've done the right research, you've done the right analysis, you'll have a winning design, which then, once that becomes the control group for everyone, it's out to 100%, then you can start isolating variables on that to understand what are the key pieces of this new design that are successful versus not, so that you can iterate. Okay, so this is kind of a sample of some of the things I've learned about user onboarding, but I've actually built an entire course around retention and engagement for Reforge with Brian Balfour, who used to lead growth at HubSpot, Sean Klaus, who led growth at Atlassian, is now Chief Product Officer at Metromile, and Andrew Chen, who used to work on growth at Uber and is now a general partner at Andreessen Horowitz. So if you want to get more of a deep dive in this, go to reforge.com, and we have an 8-week course all about retention. And with that, I'm done, so I'm happy to take questions. Okay. Should I just run from the top here? Okay, great. So the first question is, how do you find out the key action in your product, considering the product is complex and has several different personas? Great question. Essentially, the key action and the designated frequency could be different for every single persona of your product. So let's take Atlassian, right? Jira's their most popular product. And they, of course, have product managers who use the product. They have engineers who use the product. They have engineering managers who use the product. And they have designers who use the product. They're all looking to get different things out of the product, and they're all going to spend a different amount of time in the product. So what they've actually worked on is figuring out the appropriate onboarding flow for those different personas and have different metrics around kind of the key action and the designated frequency. For designers, for example, they hate Jira. They want to spend as little time as possible in it. Engineering managers are willing to spend a lot of time. It helps them out quite a bit. So they've had to completely kind of try to, at the beginning of the process, learn who is who. Maybe you just ask a question in your onboarding flow. Are you a designer, a product manager, an engineering manager, et cetera? And then build a custom onboarding flow that way. Or perhaps you infer that based on what they're using in the product. Good question. Okay, second question. What kind of psychological phenomena do you use to get people to make a habit with products? So I guess this is related to a lot of behavioral economic thinking on product development. And look, I'm a huge fan of Daniel Kahneman. There's definitely a reproducibility crisis in some of that data, but I think a lot of the insights on how people make decisions are important to think through how people will make decisions using your product. So the more that you can learn about these different, in behavioral economics, they call them biases. I don't really like that word. I think most of these, the way that people make decisions is actually completely rational. We just don't understand based on the math how it's rational. But there's ways that people make decisions. And if you can learn about these common patterns, then you can design different experiences to leverage that. So a common example is, let's say you're an e-commerce business. And depending on the price point of your product, there's an optimal strategy over whether you should show a discount based on the number that it's off, like $50 off, or a percentage off. If it's a high value item, you typically want to show the amount people are saving. So let's take Redfin, which you're buying a home. That's a very large purchase. It is much better for them to say you're going to save on average $10,000 than for them to say save 3% versus a traditional realtor, right? 3% doesn't sound like a lot until you realize how much you're spending on a home. So that's one example off the top of my head with pricing. Some other things I would think about is how to frame things as preventing a loss versus creating a win. There's some research that shows that people are more sensitive to losses versus gains. Definitely a reproducibility crisis there. But there's nothing specific to every onboarding experience that I think about when it comes to behavioral economics. It depends more specifically on the type of product, which types of potential biases and quotes you're able to run up against, and how you should design around them. Okay. How do you talk to churn users? They are usually not very motivated to give us feedback after they leave. The short answer is Amazon gift cards. Yeah, lots of money on Amazon gift cards. You're going to have a low response rate because these people don't use you. So you need to have a high value gift card, and you need to send it to a lot of people to get a bunch of people on the phone. But this is not an easy problem to solve. You just do your best, you know. Generally, the insights you're going to generate from churn users are pretty valuable. So we're willing to spend a lot of money to get them on the phone. And usually at some number, they do become financially motivated. Okay. How do you choose the best method for guiding first-time use? Should you let users navigate and explore your product or guide them through the main flow? So I have some biases on this one. You know, as I've said before, I think you should get people to the aha moment as fast as possible, but not faster. The aha moment is not reading a tutorial. It never is going to be reading a tutorial. So I like to get people into the actual product experience and then guide them around it. So they're experiencing the value firsthand. This is not always possible for every product. So for a lot of B2B products, for example, it's just not possible to show them the value until they've done an insane amount of work, and they're not willing to do that insane amount of work until they understand the value. So there's this chicken and egg problem. And in that case, some of the best things to do are to show templates, show fake projects that help people understand the value. I recently onboarded to Product Board. Has anyone tried this product before? Product Board? Okay, we got a few of you. And they have basically a ton of fake examples of fake user research, you know, fake roadmaps to help you understand how you should build yours. And that could be a good example where it isn't easy to kind of get the user using the product so that they see the value for themselves. Okay, how do we ensure that a user feedback is representative? How to find typical users. So the more that you can slice and dice your data to bucket users into, you know, here are active users, here are churn users, here are new users, et cetera, the better you can filter for things that are just wildly crazy. Like, for example, we had users who used GrubHub 3 times a day. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day. It's nuts. We know that the majority of users are never going to use GrubHub that often, as much as we would have liked that. So look, still important to talk to them, to understand, like, what the hell are you doing and why? And potentially there's some things from that we can learn, but we know they're not going to be representative of a normal human being. And what we actually found there is the people who were doing that were busy entrepreneurs. They're like, I'm just going to outsource my food problem every day to GrubHub so that I can focus on building my business, you know, being a successful freelance designer, et cetera. So it's like, oh, that's great. If we know how to target those people through marketing or whatever, we know they're going to have incredibly high lifetime value. So like, let's do that. But like, not going to help us build the most succinct onboarding flow. So yeah, there was something else I was going to say, but I totally forgot it. How to find typical users. Oh, the more research you do, the more you'll find who the outliers are versus who is representative. So invariably, when we did research at GrubHub or Pinterest, you know, the first person you talk to, you're like, I don't know if that's like really representative of us. By the time you talk to 10 users, you're like, okay, so this is persona 1, this persona 2, this persona 3. So what I usually would do in these situations is I would just continue talking to users until I feel like I'm starting to hear the same thing. And then I might survey the user base to see how many people fit into those different buckets that I'm learning from their answers qualitatively. And then that combination of like the qualitative feedback over the phone or in person, plus the survey, trying to bucket more users, helps me understand like, oh, is this 5% of the user base or 80% of the user base? qualitative research usually isn't a good way to determine that. Okay. Oh, someone's, oh. How often would you change design to still have relevant feedback from users? Where's the line between too much too soon changes and slow progress? Slow progress. Yeah. So in a product like Pinterest, we just manage this via experimentation, where you're trying to understand how the changes you're making are impacting their experience. And if you're changing things too fast, you will start to interrupt their habits, and then it will affect retention. So that's one way that we looked at that problem. And then for new users, they're only signing up once. So you can radically, hopefully they're only signing up once. So you can radically change the product experience, and it's not going to affect all of your existing users who are used to the existing product. Now, where that's different is if you dramatically re-architect how the product works, then even your existing users are going to be affected. Like when Pinterest switched from following users to following topics, all of a sudden all our existing users didn't have any topics they were following. We had to figure out how to kind of migrate them over to that model over time, or decide not to and just basically run a separate product for them. All right, I'm out of time. Thanks so much for your time this morning. Thanks for coming out.
Round of applause for Casey, please. Thank you.